to this, the fifth of China-Britain Business Council in partnership with KPMG Targeting Net Zero webinar. This is part of our series of webinars leading into the release of our report, which is in time with COP26, which will be released next month in November. And we're delighted that you can join us today. Colleagues in the UK, good morning, and colleagues joining us from China, good afternoon. We hope that today's session is insightful and interesting and sparks a few thoughts for those joining. I'm delighted that we've got an expert panel joining us today, hopefully with lots of experience around the theme of nature. So this is, like I said, the final of our 5 webinars around the themes of COP26. And this is around nature-based solutions and how the UK and China can collaborate to find nature-based solutions. And the theme of nature in COP is very broad, but today's session will be focused on agricultural solutions. We're delighted that Ian Sterling from our Beaky Distillery is with us, and we'll talk about some of the agricultural solutions. And Professor John Crawford has a large background of working on agricultural related projects. And we're also looking at some of the solutions around the built environment. So we have Helen Miles from Arup and Gary Zhao from BRE. They're looking at sort of the built environment solutions and water management, building management, etc. So it's a very broad area, but we hope that they will all come together around the theme of nature. So I'd like to thank our speakers and panelists today for joining us, and I'd like to give a very warm welcome to everyone from the China-Britain Business Council, and again to thank all our sponsors for these events. I'd now like to hand over to Professor John Crawford, who is going to moderate and chair the discussion. But before I do that, I'd actually like to give a brief intro into the running order of today's session. So we're going to have 5 minutes presentations from each of our speakers, followed by a question and answer session that's a panel discussion. So we'll have around half an hour at the end for the panel discussion, and we will invite the audience at that point to put their questions in the Q&A box. So please do listen in, and any questions you have, please do ask the questions. And of course, today's session also, we do have Chinese interpretation available for colleagues joining us in China. There's a little interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Please, you can switch on and off between English and Chinese interpretation. Professor John Crawford is going to be our first speaker. He's going to give an introduction around the theme. He's penned the introduction for the chapter in the report around nature. And Professor Crawford has a great deal of experience around strategy and management of systems, with the research focus, particularly around soil systems and food system optimization. And he's from the University of Glasgow, who are supporting and sponsoring this chapter. So thank you there, Professor Crawford. I'd like to hand over to you to give an introduction and opening 5-minute remarks.
Thank you, Tom. Just share my screen. Can people see that?
Looks like it's loading. It doesn't appear to be up on my screen yet.
Try again. There we are. Can you see that now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Tom. I'm going to try and not take up my 5 minutes. I've said that so many times before. To give the others a chance to speak, but also to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion. But what I'd like to do just before the others talk about their case studies is give a little bit of an overview and a context that links these 3 case studies together, and addresses what I think is one of the biggest challenges we face in terms of the way that humans and nature interact with each other. So there we go. I think it's very well understood that humans have had I would say, a catastrophic impact on the biosphere. Most scientists accept that we're now in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. And it differs from all of the previous mass extinctions in that rather than being driven by natural processes, it's been driven by a bunch of laws and ways of living of one of its most dominant species. And these laws are not constrained by nature and are acting to reduce the potential for life to recover. Some startling statistics on this slide. Currently, the human biomass on the planet is 10 times larger than all other wild mammals. And another stunning statistic is that biomass is only half of our livestock. So our livestock that we grow to feed us is twice our own biomass. So that fact alone has a just as indicative of the massive impact that we're having on the planet. Since the appearance of humans on the biosphere, it's estimated that the total global biomass has been reduced by 50%. Now, most of that biomass is plants. So we're talking here about primary productivity has been reduced by 50% by human activity on the biosphere. And most of that impact has happened in certainly since the Industrial Revolution, and actually even more recently than that. So the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity estimates that around 40% of our natural capital has declined just over the last 30 years. Now, it's often said, and I count the number of times that it's said at the opening remarks of a UN conference. I'm sure it will be said at the opening remarks at COP26 and COP15. Something along the lines of the way we lead our lives or our economy needs to be part of nature, not above it. Now, this is seen as a kind of a panacea for the solution that we need to align our economy with nature and not think it's something separate from nature. But in fact, although it sounds a very appealing phrase, we don't actually know what that means. But we get an idea of what it means. And we've known this for some time. So that here's a quote from John Muir, 1869, famous Scottish American ecologist that founded the national park movement in America. When we try to pick anything out by itself, we find it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe. In other words, everything is interconnected. And that means that the classic reductionist thinking doesn't apply to nature or society or economics. And there's a paper that's just been released on Archive to suggest that the way we even think about nature is completely wrong. We cannot translate our ideas about physical or engineered systems to living systems and are placed within them. So the concept of digital twin, which is often used as a very dangerous one, in my view. So we need systems thinking. We need to account for the fact that everything is connected. And there are consequences of that. So we can't fix parts of nature in isolation from other parts. We can't fix the economy in isolation of nature. We can't fix nature in isolation of the economy. We can't fix businesses by looking at the parts of businesses in isolation from the other parts. But we also have to live with uncertainty and ignorance because we never know which connections we need to think about to understand the system that we're working on, whether that's a business or whether that's nature. So we need to live with uncertainty and ignorance and not assume we know everything. We need to share innovation. That's the most rapid way to to figure out and generate solutions by sharing what works and sharing what doesn't work. We can more rapidly innovate our way out of the situation that we're in. And all of that is based on trust. And we have to trust one another, and we have to trust what we're doing, and the impacts that we're generating are those that we say that we're generating. In today's webinar, we're going to hear about 3 different system solutions and how they're being applied in both rural and urban landscapes. And of course, we need to think about how rural and urban connect with each other, because there's biodiversity in urban landscapes as well as rural landscapes. The first presentation, we're going to talk about regenerative land stewardship and how positive climate impacts are intrinsic to a successful business plan, where the whole value chain is incorporated into the strategy. The next presentation will talk about buildings within the urban environment and how buildings that are low carbon in and of themselves also enhance biodiversity and the climate footprint of the environment around them. So they look at the connection, not just of within the building, but between the building and its environment. And then finally, we'll hear about some integrative landscape approaches that can be used to bring multiple stakeholders together to realize nature-based solutions to the challenges in the urban landscape. So with that, I'd like to hand over to the first speaker, Ian Sterling, who's going to talk to us about his whole value chain solution in the business that he's started.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Arbiki Highland Estate up in sunny east coast of Scotland. This is a lovely morning sunrise, so very appropriate for this morning. Have a next slide. In terms of our vision, and John spoke about it there, we want to be one of the world's most sustainable distilleries. We're a farming and distilling business, so this is key to what we do and has been since we started. Next slide. It's very much a farming to consumer story. So as a family, we've been farming for over 400 years, almost 7 years distilling. Embedded in what we do are regenerative farming practices, which John spoke about. The key to what we do is field to bottle. Quite simply, we grow what we need to distill. That's going back to what we did in the past. That's repeating what we've done in the past. We're learning from the past. We've actually gone in reverse with a lot of the farming practices and the way we work. And in Scotland, we always traditionally grew what we were going to distill. In terms of what we do, we're distilling the world's only rye Scotch whisky, Highland Rye, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and particularly about Nadar. Very appropriate for today. Nadar is the Scottish Gaelic word for nature. So we distill the first climate positive gin and vodka in the world. It's a world-class gin. It's on sale across some of the best resorts, bars and retailers across the world. And I think the important message there is the collaboration we used in this has been adopted by some of the world's best organizations. So the message is getting through to consumers, it's getting through to retailers, and it's an ongoing conversation around both COP15 and COP26, which is coming up in Glasgow. Next slide, please. Here are some of the people we work with. So actually that message is getting through. These people are buying into what we're doing. So whether it's some of the world's best bars, like the Connaught, #1 in the world, whether it's the Mandarin Oriental, whether it's Amman Resorts, we're starting to distribute in China very soon. So we're going to be working with these organizations and bringing a piece and this learning from farm to bottle and farm to consumer. Next slide, please. In terms of product, this is the kind of thing we're doing. We're being recognized, even though we're a small startup business, we beat the world's biggest spirits business, Diageo, to win excellence in sustainability. So the industry is actually recognizing what we're doing, and we are challenging as a small startup in the practices of how the industry is working. But also, most importantly, we're collaborating and we work with a lot of our competitors. Next, please. here's Nadar, again, the Scottish Gaelic word for nature, so very appropriate for today, and I'm glad we're here to talk about what we're doing. Next, please. As I said before, it's very much a climate positive collaboration story in Nadar. It is the world's first climate positive gin and vodka. The most important thing, it's distilled with peas. So we innovated and we collaborated. So we collaborated as part of our master distiller, Kirsty Black's PhD. We were working with the James Hutton Crop Institute, a world-class crop institute in the east coast of Scotland. And Kirsty worked with Professor Graham Walker at Abertay University on a PhD. All the information's there at that link on the website. The PhD is there because we're keen to share, and we're keen to share our learnings about what we're doing.
1 minute.
Next, please. In terms of the key facts with Nadar, it saves 1.54 kilos of carbon dioxide per bottle, so it has a major impact on the environment. The peas give a nitrogen fix to the soils. It obviously reduces our need to use artificial fertilizer, which is used hugely in modern day agriculture. And as a circular economy approach, we're growing, distilling, bottling, and we're feeding the waste back to the cattle. So we're naturally recycling what we're doing. Next, please. The opportunity for the industry is to switch to GNS, a grain neutral spirit, distilled from peas rather than wheat. The environmental impact of that could be huge, and it's one that we're certainly raising with the gin industry and the drinks industry globally. In terms of the green future, we're looking and we're planning to have green hydrogen powering our distillery. We're looking at electric farm vehicles. I said before, we're doing regenerative agriculture, so we are intercropping or dual cropping just now. We're growing peas with barley in the same field. We're growing heritage barleys. We've gone back to the barleys our father used to grow, and we're going to make single malt whiskies from those. We're also adopted and just launched in the UK the Eco Spirits delivery system that will take away single-use glass bottles out of the system. So in terms of the value chain, there's a huge impact there. And I think in terms of we're creating sustainable spirits that are nature positive. Here's a quick look at Eco Spirits. There's the Eco Spirits container. That takes away the single-use glass bottles. That goes into bars and resorts around the world. And just to finish off, we've just finished and built our own distillery experience at our Beakies. So come and see what we're doing, and please come and collaborate with us. We're open to collaborations and we welcome those discussions. So please do get in touch.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ian. That was it's a beautiful example of how whole value chain solutions leading to greater levels of, well, world leading levels of sustainability, and clearly a huge business opportunity for you.
Thank you.
Next presentation, we're going to hear from Gary about sustainable buildings and sustainable environments.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the introduction, and it's been really a pleasure to contribute to this session. Surprisingly, when it comes to the topic of nature, and people barely connect the concept of buildings with nature, because building is somewhat 100% human's creation, right? Back in prehistoric days, people just live in nature, but building seems to be sort of an isolation, segregating people from nature. And it's been actually that concept for quite some time in history. So on behalf of BRE, I think it's quite interesting for me to share some ideas, some insights, to see the trend in this construction industry. How does it actually is moving towards more nature concept? So the topic would be nature, biodiversity, and engineering. And I'm Gary, heading the BRE operation in China. Next slide, please. So allow me to introduce a little bit about the company of BRE. So it's a 100-year-old organization, and it's been a national lab in the UK and running sort of a relatively smaller business in China. And that highlights the China-UK collaboration in many ways, because built environment is something among many topics very suitable from an academic and research perspective. And it's not easy to concentrate the whole 100-year-old history organization into 5 minutes introduction. But when trying to deep dive into the construction sector, we realize that it's not a lot to highlight the connection between nature and built environment. So we're very happy to share one of the case studies. Excuse me for 1 second. Sorry, it's the open space. Next slide, please.
Because you're connecting to the environment inside your own building.
Yes, very much so. And it's also a very interesting observation when it comes to whether open space is good, whether opening up some buildings would be a great idea towards the surroundings. But long story short, we're highlighting sort of a case study from IKEA, which is one of our big clients. And obviously they've launched this philosophy called One Home, One Planet. And people barely connect with a furniture manufacturer to the built environment, but it turns out that from a global perspective, they've adopted BREEAM, which is one of our best green building schemes in the world, to highlight a lot of their features, not just within the building, but also the relationship between their buildings, their shops, their stores, with the surrounding nature of it. So in BREEAM scheme, we established a chapter called Land Use and Ecology, which demonstrates a lot about how much of an impact that a construction would bring to the environment. So we've highlighted a few ecological value in terms of site inspection, in terms of what type of greeneries you're applying to the surroundings, and what type of influence would that action actually bring and affect the existing site ecology. So it's actually outside of the traditional engineering field. It's actually sort of an eye opener to a lot of construction experts, only to realize that, okay, the nature of the building, the surrounding of the building is actually heavily impacting a lot of my design. For instance, will the external lighting actually impact the species living near the building at night? Will my emission actually create a microclimate in the surroundings of the building that actually interferes with the habits of the existing species? And more importantly, we recommend a lot of these buildings to apply certain features to help with the existing species to find a good habitat, if not staying put. So a lot of these features are being incorporated in a building, especially a green building scheme, and adopted by IKEA. So that's some sort of a concept embedded to IKEA's ESG strategy from a high level, from their board level. And that would be, I believe, a great showcase to look at how much of a corporate would look at the importance of nature, and from not just from a compliance perspective, but also from a caring perspective. And next slide, please.
Just 1 minute left, Gary.
Sure. I'm wrapping up in fact. So we would like to wrap this up with a quote from the sustainability director from IKEA. So the built environment used to focus on the indoors. When you look at the indoor lighting, the indoor air quality, the VOCs, CO2s, and all the contaminants, it's all about human-centric. But it's time to move forward and start focusing on the nature, on biodiversity, and on the broader environment of Earth, because ultimately that's the planet we live in, and that's the relationship that every human should be caring about. And that's the closure of my presentation. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Gary. I think it's a fascinating insight into what looks like a significant transformation of the way we think about buildings and the urban environment. I look forward to the discussion on that. I've got a few questions myself. Then finally, the final presentation is from Helen Miles from Arup, who is going to take us up another scale to urban landscapes and the interaction between natural processes and urban design, and integrative approaches to solutions to some challenges in the urban environment. Helen.
Good morning. hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So good morning. I'm going to talk this morning about, as John said, my experience working with nature-based solutions in primarily urban environments. In my 5 minutes, we're just going to sort of run through a case study, which is the Shanghai Stormwater Master Plan. So this was developing a nature-based stormwater master plan for the urban area of Shanghai. So this Shanghai is a city that's been shaped by water through its existence. The Hangpu River flows through the city. The city has a large number of challenges surrounding water. It's incredibly low lying, it's close to the sea, and it has had massive urbanization and population growth, which is increasing runoff, and it's increasing water demand, but also the number of people at risk of flooding. Our work in Shanghai started in 2018 when we answered a call from the city board for an international design competition to look at how different solutions for how stormwater could be managed in Shanghai. To do that, we actually partnered with a local Chinese organisation called SUC to bring our international knowledge of working with cities and their knowledge of working in China and some of the unique challenges that brought. So our approach to the Shanghai Master Plan was looking at a systems-led strategy, which consisted of 4 main layers. The first of those layers is the governance, about how you manage your stormwater and your city approach. We then looked at the impact green infrastructure could have. That's your traditional SUDs or your nature-based solutions, things like bioswales and rain gardens. We looked at the blue infrastructure, which in this case was working with the existing waterways in Shanghai to bring them back to life and to use them in a more intelligent manner. And then also the grey infrastructure, which in this is using the traditional solutions. So identifying that in a city like Shanghai, we will do as much with the nature as we can, but sometimes to protect those people, we still have to look at some of those traditional tunnelling or water storage options. To do this, we actually used a piece of machine learning technology we've developed to allow us to look at the whole of the city very, very quickly. So we only had a matter of months to create this master plan. So we have a machine learning tool that could look at the whole of this area, which was our study area, and categorize it into different land uses, but rather than traditional land uses that you might find through planning, these are around how that land is used, which allows us to put the best solutions in. So we looked at the high rise, we looked at parks, we looked for railways, we looked for roads, we looked for rivers, and we looked at different types of residential areas because they each have different ways that you can use water within them. This allowed us to create a network of different solutions for each of the 285 stormwater districts in Shanghai. So we were able to create a basket of solutions for each one. So you can see here some of the interventions we proposed in the master plan. So we have things on the surface, working with putting green spaces into the environments, some using the existing network to a better capacity, and then sometimes actually having to put in localized storage, because that was the only solutions in some of the very dense areas. We also, as you say, looked at optimizing the river and canal network. So this allowed us to come up with a unique solution for each of the districts. So you see some sort of examples here of random districts within the Shanghai area and how the solution to managing the stormwater flooding and also the water quality runoff for each of those districts can sort of be a selection of the different options. So our overall master plan created this sort of patchwork effect across Shanghai of what the primary use for each of these districts could be. This allowed us to create some lovely imagery around what you could do to bring nature back into the streets of Shanghai. So you can see here we've got some sort of relatively hard urban spaces, and then by bringing in the nature-based solutions at the bottom, how you can not only manage your stormwater in an effective way, but you also create an environment that's adding more. Since we completed that, we've then been moving on to look at a district pilot. So this is the Minyang district in Shanghai. And what we've been looking here is proving that the solutions we developed on a very large scale, very quickly using our machine learning tools, could actually work when you dive into a district. So this top photo here just shows a traditional street in the Minyang district. And then we've sort of got some artist impressions about what you could do to bring that back to life and to manage the water. So it's already quite a green area, but if you make that more intelligent, you can move on to having some of these curbs which let the water in. And then if you go further, you can increase that environment to make it somewhere people want to be and somewhere want to live. And what that does is it creates a real opportunity to not only manage your stormwater, but improve the quality of life. So we've then been taking this idea further that the green infrastructure can not only help us manage the water in our cities, but also provide additional benefits. So we've now been looking at the city of Guangzhou, and this is a Limwang pilot. So you can see here we've been using this 7 pillars approach to look at what does blue-green infrastructure or nature-based solutions, the terms get used a bit in, they just sort of get, each one gets used. So we can see here that we can identify the different types of solutions we might propose. So, you know, we've got rain gardens and bioswales and deep verge rain gardens, permeable pavings, planting trees. And we can then match them against the different benefits. Some of these are very traditional, for example, flooding and water quality, and that's why we're proposing them. And some of them are more abstract in the traditional engineering sense, looking at mental health and education, urban heat island reduction and economic growth. And this allows us to be able to really focus on the right kinds of solutions for a city. So quite often when we're proposing flooding solutions, there's a number of different combinations we can use. But if we start looking at the other benefits, we can start looking at which one's actually more beneficial, not just from a cost or a flooding perspective, but from a wider environmental perspective. And then what this approach allows us to do is we can actually start quantifying at a master planning scale some of the solutions. So these are just some examples here from Guangzhou, which show that from a high level master planning scale, we haven't done any street design, we haven't focused in anything above creating examples. We can look at the potentials across different cities for reducing. These are just the key indicators the Guangzhou master plan was interested in, which is looking at creating natural habitat, about planting trees, about carbon sequestration, and about removing pollutants from the watercourses. And this allows us to start talking to the right stakeholders, because once we can start quantifying what we can do, we can talk to health authorities, we can talk to education authorities, we can talk to different people. Because one of the major challenges we find with bringing nature-based solutions into cities is around funding and identifying funding for these solutions, but also about creating buy-in, because sometimes you're removing people's car parking spaces or you're changing the streets and what they're used to looking at, and you have to get that stakeholder buy-in. One of the particular challenges we've had is, especially in Guangzhou, was looking at what we can do in private areas, because you need to change the land in private areas. So here we've been actually looking at, in Guangzhou particularly, focusing on what can we do just meeting the public sector requirements for sponge cities.
Could you just wrap up, Helen?
Yep. And so yeah, I was wrapping up. So thank you very much.
That was a fascinating, lots of issues raised there that we need to deal with to get these sort of things implemented at scale and quickly. So thanks very much to everybody for the presentations and for keeping to time. And for those who are listening in, we're now moving into the Q&A session, and there's at the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll find a Q&A box that you can just click, and you can type your question. And oh, in fact, here we are. That's exactly what the bottom of the Zoom window looks like. Click on the Q&A to ask some questions. And there's an interpretation button there too, if you need that. So please go ahead and ask some questions of the panel. And whilst they're doing that, I'm going to open up with a question whilst we're waiting for people to fill in that Q&A box. If you want to, we had a very nice example there of where Arup have quantified the impact and the multiple co-benefits of nature-based solutions. The next challenge, of course, is to value those and then get people to pay for them. And that requires a huge culture change, of course. But can we just return to the issue of measuring impact? And I wonder if anybody would like to comment on whether they find that easy to, I'm thinking of, if we're going to take this to scale, how are you quantifying impact within your organizations in a way that that makes the business case clear? Who would like to start?
Yeah, John, I think I can kick this one off while we're looking for some more ideas. So only from BRE's perspective, because of the fact that we've been working on the sustainability industry for so many years, and it's becoming obvious that if you talk about sustainability, it's very, very difficult to justify it from a commercial perspective, because for every client, for every project, if you're trying to add value by doing something that's more sustainable, that's going to either add up your cost or either to add up to the complexity of your projects. But if you look at it from another angle, not trying so hard to justify it through a commercial perspective, but trying to diversify your branding, trying to diversify the mindset compared to your peers, that's something able to allow a corporate to look at it from a branding perspective. For instance, for people who are not caring about biodiversity, for people who are not paying attention to it, compared to their peers who are. And then that gives them a sort of a disadvantage, limiting their capability to position themselves as the industry leading role. Because to lead something, to lead an industry, you definitely need to think ahead. You need to think ahead of your peers. And believe it or not, there are always leaders in every industry. I can only speak for the construction industry, but obviously there are forerunners and there are followers. And it goes back to the company to decide whether they want to become a forerunner or a follower. So that's the decision from a board level. And that's also the reason why sustainability could only be properly decided from higher up level instead of project by project trying to scramble up and make justifications. That's the broader perspective we would state.
Thank you. Ian, I think you've unmuted yourself, which is an indication that you're about to speak.
It is indeed. I think there's an important piece in there to do with family business. We're building a legacy business. We've inherited a legacy business. We're custodians of our land, of what we inherited, but also we need to pass up that on to next generation. So we need to be very mindful of the long-term impact and actually look after the environment we're in. So I think that's where family businesses or longer-term businesses that don't have the pressure of shareholding sometimes can make longer-term strategic decisions. And that's why it's kind of embedded in our culture or just the way we work. And it's not always the cost, because actually, just now we've been planting oak trees that take 50 years to grow. We won't be around to see the oak trees. We may use them for casts in the future, or we may just, the next generation may just go, actually, we'll just keep the trees the way they are because we're improving our living and working environment.
That's a very interesting perspective on family versus shareholder-run businesses, or board-run. Yeah. Well, and Philip in the Q&A has just pointed out it's trailblazer versus follower, and that's I think an important point. Helen, in Arup, how easy is it for you or your colleagues to convince the board that you can make money out of the business of sustainability?
I think this is very much coming from our board. So we've had a new Arup strategy that sort of puts sustainability above everything else. So it's a really interesting time to be looking at that. So that's both how we can be sustainable in what we deliver and how we can be sustainable as an organization in terms of our own working and what we can do. I think in terms of promoting sustainable solutions, I think we're in a really interesting place at the moment, because we are beginning to look at ways of monetizing how you can be sustainable. So, for example, in some of that wider benefit work we've been doing, we can now finding ways of being able to monetize those benefits using some guidance that's being developed, and that makes it much easier to sell sustainable solutions to clients when you can say that this is the monetized benefit of going down these sustainable approaches.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned that there's a challenge because in many cases, nature-based solutions, by the nature of the fact that they connect to everything, generate a whole bunch of co-benefits, which implicate a whole bunch of stakeholders who benefit in a very financial way, in ways that can be measured financially. I think water's probably a good example of this. How ready do you think those stakeholders are to contribute to the cost of these kinds of transformations?
At the moment, it's a very localized approach. So in some places you find stakeholders who are on board, who are working together and are ready to go with these things. So there's been some really successful work in Sheffield at the moment where the council have really come on board in supporting the implication of SUDs in their city centre and what they can do. In other places where they're a lot further back in terms of getting on board, because sometimes it means that, for example, and this is a very UK context, but a water company might say, right, we want to take a SUDS approach to managing our stormwater risk in this area. But actually, once it's on the surface, who's going to manage, who's going to maintain, who's going to clean, who's going to look after? And sometimes it has to fall to councils, or does it fall to highways? And it's a very siloed approach to who manages what, and it's about making those connections to allow these solutions to go forwards. And quite often it's not about paying to put them in the first place, it's about the maintenance and long-term the long-term maintenance of the solutions we find the challenges. Thank
you. We shouldn't ignore the fact that right now we've got probably the most important biodiversity conference happening in China, and we've just heard that in his opening remarks, the president of China declare the so-called Kunming Declaration, which will reflect the political will of all parties to send a strong message to the international community about our strong determination and consensus in the field of biodiversity. And they've committed over 1 billion yuan to help developing countries fix the biodiversity. And my own experience of working in China over the past 20 years and building public-private partnerships between the UK and China, I think there's these two nations have a very strong and in some ways very ambitious plan to address the biodiversity and climate challenges. I'd be interested to hear what people in the attendees and also the panel think about the relative importance of top-down, so political, for example, top-down solutions versus bottom-up. So how does the consumer and the beneficiary of these kinds of solutions play a role? So Gary mentioned that brand is important. Well, how do you value that? Is it a question of maintaining relevance with your customer base? It's not just about competing, but actually staying relevant. The worst thing that can happen to a company is it becomes irrelevant. That's, again, quite hard to value. So yeah, I'd like to hear people's views on the relative importance of top-down versus bottom-up approaches to these kinds of challenges.
Mm-hmm. I think I could pick that one up because it's really interesting to see Helen's presentation regarding the Shanghai's water drainage system upgrade, because I personally live in Shanghai for many years, and I know for a fact that it's the reason why a lot of project owners in Shanghai are starting or were starting to looking at that question is because Shanghai had, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that policy of a sponge city in place to start to influence from a top-down approach, requesting a lot of ongoing projects to really think about that upgrade and what type of impact that would bring forward to the overall municipal system. If you're not doing something already, start thinking about it. And if you're doing it already, that's great, improving and keep doing what you do. I think that's the ultimate policy driving force from top down. And as we all know, China is really keen on utilizing that central government's power to influence from a top down. And I think for sustainability industry, that's more important than any others, because you can't really rely on the trailblazers in the industry to take all the lead. You got to encourage the majority of the group of the companies to follow through. And by regulating and incentivizing those actions, I think that's also a critical force. And also plus the catastrophe impact which people all observe in this year alone in China, there have been multiple flood instincts and causing a lot of destruction across many cities, many regions in China. So that could serve as the stick and plus the carrot from a government, and that combined as a joint force to really reform a lot of people's thinking and to make a really impact, even if for the higher up people to make decisions. I think that's the observation we got in terms of the relevancy. So it's not about branding alone, but it's all about how do you actually mobilize all the people to collectively tackle the challenges ahead of us.
So Philip Kirsch in the Q&A has raised the issue of that, which is reflected in many conversations around this whole area, is that there's been a lot of talk of commitment and even pledging of money. How do we turn that into tangible impact on the ground at scale, and that delivers the impact that we need in time? My feeling is that there's investment money out there. That's not the constraint. What seems to be the constraint is almost a lack of ambition amongst the corporate community. And I'm not pointing fingers at any single corporate, because I think this goes above the level of individual corporates. What we're looking for, what I'm thinking here is, what's the potential for coalitions of corporates, both within sectors and across sectors, of getting together and actually delivering together with the funding that is the investment funding that is available for this kind of impact investment? How do we corral companies and corporates within and between sectors to get around a table and be ambitious and actually make a plan that will address these challenges and deliver on it? To what extent are the organizations represented here part of any kind of coalition that's thinking globally? Recognizing that this is not a solution for any single company, it's a solution for society, including every company. Ian, you've just unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I think in terms of say the whiskey industry, there's the Scotch Whisky Association, which is the governing body or the group body for the industry, and it's making great progress forward in trying to drive the industry as a global industry. It has the Scottish word on it, but the SWA is very much the whiskey industry, which is very much located in Scotland. So I think those bodies exist, but I think also business should be doing it anyway when they're looking at their own supply chain, is the fact that we've got partners right across the world, whether we're distributing in China, our logistics partners delivering it to our partners in collaboration on products. So say the Abertay or the James Hutton, there's so many people in that supply chain that I think if businesses have ambition and people bring money to the table to, I guess, pump prime or help those initiatives to begin with, I think that's the position of government or the green investment organizations, is to try and speed up that process or look at individual people like ourselves who are working on a smaller scale, but looking at how these things can be scaled up. Because I think that's where government or the industry organizations need to be ambitious, as you say. They have to up their ambitions because time is running out.
So I'm recognizing we've got 10 minutes. I totally agree with that. I guess the issue is that, and I'm mindful of time, that I'm going to invite you all to suggest a call to action, right? Just to give you a bit of a heads up. And I invite the attendees as well to put forward their call for action. What do you think we need to do to deliver the impact that's required at the scale and time needed? We see a lot of stuff going on, a lot of great stuff. And Ian, I think what your business is doing is fantastic. It's clearly the case. I admire Arup for their the efforts they put into convening stakeholders to deliver integrated solutions and come up with clever tools for identifying those and proposing them. The BRE, fantastic initiative connecting buildings to their external environment. All of these interconnections are really important. What I find interesting is that I think we know how to do this. What seems to be holding things back is the ability to come together at scale. So in other words, the challenge to me seems to be about convening. Now, the World Economic Forum supposedly is a convening organization. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development are convening organizations. What would you say that the next Davos meeting in January, following COP15, following COP26, what do you think the world business leaders in Davos should be committing to in January that will really deliver verifiable impact at scale and with a level of ambition that's needed to deliver the solutions? Whilst you're thinking of that, I'm going to give you a few more minutes to think about it. There's another question in the Q&A, which is, I'll just read it out. The biodiversity impact of traditional Chinese medicine is enormous and seems to be growing as people become more wealthy. The illegal wild animal trade appears to be very lucrative. Is there any discussion in China about changing public perceptions and long-held cultural values in this and other areas, as well as top-down policy and international accords? So I would like to suggest that this is not a China problem. That is a problem in many countries. And I think, to be fair, the West bears a lot of the guilt and a lot of the responsibility for the destruction of the biosphere. But it is an issue that different cultures have different perspectives about how we connect with nature already. Some of those connections, some of those cultures, particularly in the West, put us above nature. I would say that cultures in the East are more like seeing humans as part of nature. How do we reconcile these different cultures and respect those different cultures, whilst at the same time proposing this call to action? So there's an additional twist on each of your call to action that I'm going to ask you for. So Gary, because you've taken yourself off mute, I'm going to ask you first. What would be your call to action for Davos?
In terms of call for action, I think I don't really personally believe that Davos or any economic associations will be able to collectively tackle that, because I sort of run a business here, and I deeply understand that from a commercial perspective, it's always selfish. It's always about how I could gain a competitive edge if my peers, my competitors are being restrained. And I definitely would want, as a businessman, would want to take advantage of that. But the real solution, the real cure would come from the top. So only when the regulation is equally, fairly applying the force to every single competitor, and then that's when the industry becomes fair, because everyone, think about taxation, because of the fact that every company would have to pay for tax, and that no longer becomes a disadvantage, but it becomes a rule. So same goes for carbon taxation that people talk about these days. And I believe in soon future, it'll be about biodiversity tax. If a corporate is harming biodiversity, and there will be tax for it, or other punishment or in any form. So I think that's what would be fair, and that's what would be the ultimate force to drive the whole industry, not just a few corporates, but the whole industry moving towards the direction where we want them to move. So I think that's the call for actions: more regulations, more policy making from top down, and to really influence that and let the business world to adapt to that regulation. I think they will absolutely figure out at the end of the day. So that would be my call for actions.
Can I just remind everybody that nature is itself predicated on competition and selfishness, the selfish gene, and survival of the fittest, but it still manages to be sustainable for 5 billion years. So selfishness on its own is not a sin, but I expect it's because nature is not actually as selfish as Darwin proposed, but the interconnections between the different components of nature are actually self-supporting. So there's a lot of sharing goes on in nature, and cooperation goes on in nature, whilst competition coexists with that. So you're right that we need to set some, I suggest that you're right, that we need to set the right kind of constraints on how economies work that are similar to those constraints that operate in nature. Who wants to go next?
I'm happy to
go. Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think stands out to me every time we talk about this is we've probably got to start answering those uncomfortable questions and putting ourselves in an uncomfortable place. I don't think what's not working at the moment is trying to sort of make small changes to what, obviously every person making a small change will help, but I don't think it's going to make the scale change on the scale in which we need to see. And I think it's very easy as well to sit in my nice centrally heated house with my car outside that I could drive to the shops and go, oh, if only I had an electric car, the world would be saved. I don't think that's the solution. But also we have to look at this from a global perspective. It's no good as well sitting in a developed country and saying, oh no, you can't build any coal power stations, coal's bad, without providing those alternative solutions. We've had the benefit of all of this development, and we have to be very aware of the uncomfortable questions of, just because we're now through there, we can't stifle development because of that. And it's about finding that solution that allows equality, as well as those really uncomfortable truths.
Thank you. And quickly, Ian, just like to add to that.
Probably three things: mapping the global data so we know exactly what's there. I think a roadmap for change to improve collaboration, and also I think lastly publicizing the champions, or as was talked about before, the trailblazers, so people get the publicity they deserve, whatever scale they're at, because then it forces the bigger organizations or the smaller ones to adopt what they're doing.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to the organizers, because I know there's a few final announcements at the end. Thank you all for your contributions, and thank you to the attendees for their questions as well.
Thanks a lot, John. Thanks to all the panelists today. That was a really interesting discussion. Lots of thought-provoking things came out of that from my side. I think that was excellent. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and speakers today. That's great, and say thank you to all the participants for joining. Obviously, this session has been recorded, and we will share it with people that obviously couldn't attend, or if people want to rewatch it back, then they can. I just want to talk a little bit about the upcoming next steps really for our report for this Targeting Net Zero series and the report. So on the 9th of November in Glasgow at the Strathclyde Business School, University of Strathclyde, we will have a Targeting Net Zero launch event with talking about the role of UK-China business, and there'll be a panel discussion at that event around how UK-China business can collaborate to tackle the challenges we've been discussing in this session, and to officially launch our reports, which will be launched up then. And then we will also have a launch event in China a few days before the event in Glasgow on the 4th of November. In Beijing, we'll be launching the report on the Chinese side, because it's a UK-China report in English and in Chinese. So that's the launch events. At COP26 as well, we will have a business banquet on the 9th of November in Glasgow. And you can see that the tickets will be on sale very soon, I believe, for that, for members and non-members. So that's that. Thank you again for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye for now.